Everybody, welcome to Rev'd for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, and I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm John Kennedy.
And so today we have Jesus as prophet speaking out against how easy it is to get a divorce in the first century. This is Mark chapter 10, verses 2 to 16. Let's have at it. Some of the Pharisees came, and to test Jesus they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. Okay, so teachings on divorce in the Bible, of course, are tender topics for many, many people and for our culture as a whole. So let me give some context about Jesus in the first century and that which he was speaking into. Remembering, as you two know, we are in that part of Mark where Jesus is teaching his disciples. In fact, he even goes from the Pharisees to in the house, and so it's how disciples ought to behave. And the first century context we have, as I said at the outset, Jesus is speaking as a prophet, so he's speaking into the culture of divorce that is going on in his world here. And because he is a Jewish man, he is speaking from that perspective primarily. And so just to give that context again, it starts in particular from Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4, but in particular, the first sentence, "Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her, and so he writes her a certificate of divorce." That phrase that is translated something objectionable, ervat davar, in Hebrew, which is translated as, which in its original literally means the nakedness of a thing, and gets translated and it can be displeasing or objectionable. But in Jesus' day, just as in our day, we have different schools of thought about what that word in particular might mean. And we have the conservative school from the Rabbi Shammai, and that is a focus on the nakedness, back to the nakedness of a thing, and so you could get divorced only if the issue was moral. In other words, there was adultery. Or the second rabbinical school, which was the majority opinion of Jesus' day, was from Hillel, as our college campuses have Hillel, named after the same rabbi. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and Hillel and their world focused on the thing, the nakedness of the thing. And therefore, a man, and I'm sure we're going to get to a woman here in a moment, but a man can divorce for almost any reason, including annoyance, and famously, if things are burnt, which, of course, put women in an incredibly precarious position. I'm going to be quiet on that because we're going to get to Jesus opening up to women too. But there's the rabbinical conversation that Jesus is speaking into.
Yeah, I think that's a great setup, and I think highlights for me what the heart of this teaching is, which is Jesus is really being a feminist here. His teaching on divorce and the standards around that is very difficult, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I think just to start, Jesus is speaking into a situation where women were, as you said, in a very precarious situation. However, that teaching from Deuteronomy was interpreted, liberal or conservative, so to speak, either way, women were basically without agency in this arrangement. Only a husband, according to Jewish law, could initiate divorce. And the question of whether Jewish women living under Roman occupation could do so is another one. Maybe we'll put a flag in that to revisit. But basically, this is all at the discretion of men. And if a woman found herself divorced or dismissed, she was without security, without without basically perhaps the necessities to really have any kind of livelihood. And indeed, that Deuteronomy passage goes on to say that if a woman is dismissed, that is divorced, and then she goes on to marry another man, and then that man either dies or dismisses her, the first man cannot remarry her because she has been defiled. And that's in the Bible, and I think that's awful, frankly, really, really awful. Reflects certainly the misogyny of whoever set that down, quite frankly. So Jesus is speaking into that. I think he is trying to correct this in a big way and say that to men, basically, if you marry a woman, you are obligated to care for her for life. So I think that's at least where I'd like to start.
I think it's also notable that he goes all the way back to the beginning of creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's not really getting into the weeds with them over a legal argument or a moral argument. He's just, he's talking about the grand vision of how creation was intended and what God intended for male and female to become one flesh. And it's so primal for Jesus, and he's always trying to reunite the divisions of our world. And I think that this is just a case scenario for him, where men and women are meant to be in equal partnership and also united. You know, the man in the beginning was meant to separate from his household and join his wife and become one flesh. And so the pain of it isn't that. Well, it is the woman, it's patriarchy, that's driving this wedge between male and female, and not as, more than divorce itself. And so I think Jesus is trying to recall for them that under their watch, there's Israel, could be a lot better, and they've lost sight of the entire vision. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really kind of a beautiful way that Jesus navigates this argument.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the way you talked about it in a way that resonates with, as you often, your vision of what the work of Jesus is, the vision that is biblical too, not just your vision, but the vision of the unity of all. And yeah, so Jesus, they ask him a legal question. Notice the Pharisees ask a legal question. He then asks them a question in return about the law. And he, his reason, number one, he just dismisses the law as a concession to human sinfulness. And then he, by going back to conflating those two passages in Genesis, you're right. He talks about what's the ideal. He doesn't plunge into legalizing, you can't do it if the food is burnt or this or that. He doesn't,
right.
He really goes back, doesn't actually answer it with reference to divorce.
Right.
To the ideal of marriage, or that unity that was God's intention. So divorce was never God's intention.
Right. And furthermore, he privately to his disciples, he gives equal consequence to male or wife or husband if they divorce. They both are committing adultery if they marry another. So he gets them back on kind of level footing in a way. And also I wanted to just note that he talks about Moses writing a law to accommodate their hard hearts, and I can think of so many laws in our society that just accommodate our bad behavior. When you talk about like money, taxation, and there's all sorts of loopholes and things that accommodate our conniving, scheming ways,
Yeah.
And we there's not like the overarching vision considered when we're making our micro legal system,
Absolutely, which I think is such a great insight as to why Jesus was not content to teach people what was lawful. Rather, he pointed beyond the law to the condition of the heart that the law was always meant to point to and to form. But when we're at the level of the letter of the law only, we get into all this minutia of like, can I get away with this? Can I get away with that? Where Jesus is really saying the eye that wants to bend the law to fit what feels expeditious or desirable for me, that sort of sense of I really needs to be transformed at the level of the heart.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that on that back to the along with the hard-heartedness questions, that in the Hebrew Scriptures, hard-heartedness has to do essentially with, the root of it is humanity's relationship with the divine, and that when we are hard-hearted and we have to be soft-hearted to receive the Spirit of God, and when we get hard-hearted, we don't receive the Spirit, and when sorry for the vertical relationship. Sorry for doing it that way. But when that vertical relationship gets hardened, and in the Greek here, literally hardening of the arteries, essentially, this is where we get arterial sclerosis. But it also then hardens the relationship on the sort of horizontal person-to-person plane too.
I found this to be an especially challenging podcast to prepare for, not only for the content of the text itself, but just with the knowledge that, of course, we all have, that this touches people's experience in a way that a lot of passages don't quite in the same way. So I found that to be a great challenge. But I think it's important to bring things back to the level of the heart here, and we can perhaps discuss the minutia. I mean, here Jesus does not give the sort of exception to the rule here that he does in Matthew's telling of this teaching, which is that divorce is allowable on the grounds of adultery. And this also echoes a teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul's talking about marriage, and he says that people who are married should stay married, but if a believer marries an unbeliever and the unbelieving spouse wants to separate, then that's okay. The believer should just let it be. So like already, even in the New Testament itself, we see the difficulty of this teaching being grappled with and sort of filtered through the reality of like lived experience and so on.
Oh yeah, I mean we're all going to agree that look what happens in our offices, that this question about marriage and divorce and what does God think, and people wrestling with all this stuff. That little piece that you just referred to from Paul is actually part of Roman Catholic doctrine. That if a Roman Catholic is married to a non-believer, and this divorce situation arises, the church blesses it and says, yes, have at it, now marry a believer, sort of thing. But there is no doubt that that Jesus is, what Jesus says in his day is uncomfortable. That's why the disciples take him aside and come inside like, hey boss, help us out here. And Jesus' words land uncomfortably in our world too, because there's no question that marriages come to places of discomfort.
I mean, as a person who's not married, and when I'm, preparing people for marriage, I always think about the petitions in the prayers where it says, and may all married persons witnessing these vows do all in their power to support these persons in their marriage. And I take out the word married persons because I feel like marriage is like one way we're given to live out the challenge of becoming better at love and better at community and better at making a household. And, our relationships all require the same kind of elasticity and forgiveness and reconciliation. And, marriage is maybe the most challenging and also maybe the most wonderful, possibly for some. And I don't think Jesus, he's not getting into every scenario here. And obviously, there are many marriages in our world where one person's being abused or, it's a horrifying situation. And there's no way that you would just be required to stick it out and battle it out. I mean, there's a place where the hardness of heart would be to force a person to stay in a relationship like that. So I think all of our relationships are meant to help us evolve into unified humans, So I think that's where even more so Jesus's argument here is helpful for everyone, married or not, or divorced or not, that our relationships are invitations for us to figure out how to become one flesh with humanity.
Yeah, that's interesting. I now change the way I administer the wedding rite based on your thought. I mean, when Sam got married last weekend,
Oh wow!
I don't know if you noticed, I did not on that collect. I dropped out the married, and so for all persons.
Yeah, I did not notice.
Yeah, no, subtle and fast, but nonetheless. And I also would just say that, I mean, you're the one who prepares all of my children for marriage, and they all give rave reviews here. But I do think that.
Time will tell.
I do think that the questions here that we can, by Jesus going back to the ideal here, so he goes literally back to the book of Genesis. And interestingly enough, it's in the same chapter where the second conflated piece of those two, the first sentence comes from Genesis 1 and the second from the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 2. And the Adam and Eve story ends up with the fall, right? And then as a Kent School student years ago when I was doing, they had to describe what happened in the creation stories, and this kid wrote, it was English as a second language, he said, after Adam and Eve got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, all hell broke loose. And I gave the kid an A. I mean, it was totally inappropriate on an academic essay, but it's true. Yeah. And so really, we get the Mosaic law laid in. I thought one of the interesting thing there is he says Moses wrote this because of the heart of Sarah. He didn't say God handed this down like the Mosaic law is handed down from the divine. Moses just was this, keep the scripture, just keeping it. Now he's saying Moses wrote this. Right. Very interesting on the, hermeneutics.
What other laws did Moses write?
Exactly. Yeah. Jesus doing a little hermeneutical work here.
It's amazing.
Just kind of barely slipped in, but nonetheless noticeable.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm surprised at how easy this conversation about divorce has been for me, and Jesus' teaching on it. Are we ready to? Oh, listen,
we're veterans of this. If you want to check out another one, it was pod number 5.
Oh my gosh.
Years ago. God knows what we said 3 years ago. Right. Yeah, but let's switch gears here. Yeah, thanks, John. Let's switch gears here and to one of the most beloved pieces of scripture. We go from one of the most that most people say, oh my God, Jesus talking about divorce, and now we have Jesus, people bringing little children to him, and Jesus, lifting them up when the disciples say, hey, get these little kids, these little rugrats out of here. What do you make of this?
I don't know if it's such a shift. It's the second time he's brought up children and put them in the center as a case in point or an illustration of what he's been talking about. And, if he meant to point up the female, oppressive situation in marriage, or potentially within the context of the laws around divorce, children are even more so at the mercy of marriage and divorce. And it's not spelled out here, but it kind of follows that, the reason that we're all meant to be as one flesh, in a household, is that the children, they have absolutely no agency, no status, no protection without the household that's taking care of them. And so, not that that's what Jesus is talking about, but I think in Mark, children represent the object of the way of the cross, where, it's to the least of these that we turn our attention and our energy. And so it's just opening up of the whole, softening of the heart, receiving the little ones.
Yeah, I think it goes very well with the previous passage for what you just said. I see Jesus as just being so utterly exasperated by this sort of male culture of I'm the greatest, and trying to be the one with the most power or associate with the ones with the most power, and all this stupid stuff that obviously Jesus had no part of, that his disciples were still sort of wound up in. And he's speaking against it in the teaching on marriage and divorce, and he's speaking against it indignantly, right? We're told that Jesus is indignant when his disciples try to get these children away from him. He says, let the children come to me. Jesus is not interested in power games, quite obviously, as the crucified Messiah. And I think he's saying to his disciples here that entering the kingdom has nothing to do with achievement, abilities, behavior, or your status. Rather, entering the kingdom comes about when you are receptive to it. He says, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God. You don't achieve it, you receive it. As a child will never enter it. And actually, you should look to these children as your teacher for what it looks like to have the quality of being necessary to enter the kingdom. And in this, he's, I think, quite a lot like St. Paul in his teaching on justification by faith, right? That we don't achieve our salvation, we don't achieve our rightness or our unity with God. It is something that can only be received.
Yeah, I also agree that the word receive is an enormous thought and word in all this. And John, you sometimes talk about like Jesus as Zen master here. To my mind, this is a Zen master question here. Where the Zen master breaks through the paradigms of how we understand reality, or seeks to, by giving us maxims, or this is a kreya. This is an action that has a maxim in it. And that this is, the pineapple upside down cake. Jesus takes everything in our culture and flips it upside down and basically says the good stuff's on the bottom. And so he overturns the whole of our cultural paradigm, and bloop, and he does it with the little children, leaving again the disciples to go, oh man. And so this, we'd spoken about this in one of the other podcasts, that the major work of our spiritual life is not the building up of something, it's the undoing of something.
Right.
And the breaking down of that which has been the false stuff built up, the Tower of Babel built up within us. It's the breaking down of that, and so the whole thing it's like an Escher drawing, to climb the ladder you have to go down, sort of thing. Everything is it's all upside down.
I love that you put it that way, that the good stuff's on the bottom. And I think if anyone who's been around little kids long enough knows that the way they receive things is because they really like the shiny, pretty object or fun toy, and they see what they want and they go and get it because it's appealing. And, I think Jesus, his life, his works, his signs, his teaching, they're supposed to present a vision of something appealing and wonderful. And, it's laden with a lot of, gospel writer language, or I don't know what, but somehow it's obscured to us, I think, in that way. When you spend enough time with it, yes, you can really see the joy and the beauty and the rightness, and it resonates, but you have to be the little kid that plays with it for a while, and sees how undeniably desirable it is to move into this way of it being. So I don't know if that's what Jesus means, but you don't receive things as a little child that are burdensome and hard and edgy and depriving. And, we've done it all backwards because we try to make it such a moral code and hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Jesus's teachings are very often hard, but they're interpreted wrongly, basically, by so many people and so many traditions. Jesus's teachings are challenging for the sort of grown-up, egocentric mind or self that wants to control and be number one and grab the power and just sort of manipulate reality for its own ends. And Jesus is like, chipping away at that. He's like knocking away at that. And if you're really wrapped up in that, if that's who you think you are, if you don't know who you are apart from that sort of scheme, then you have a lot Jesus to lose. Is like a brick wall for you. But if you allow that to sort of be broken up, or it already is a little bit broken up for you, as Leonard Cohen said, you just quoted it in your sermon, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. If that's part of your personality or your orientation, then you can see how Jesus says elsewhere, like, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, right? Like this is the good and easy way if you receive it as such. Speaking of Jesus as Zen master, this teaching has been likened to the Zen teaching of beginner's mind, of coming to your life, to every day, to every moment, really, with a sense of openness and simplicity and kind of perhaps wonder, without the sort of jaded lenses that adults so often view the world through, thinking like, oh, here we go again, or I've been here before, or whatever, or I know what's going on here. And I think that's very apropos. As somebody who has integrated quite a lot of Buddhism into my Christian spiritual path, I can say that when I am sort of grounded in that sort of frame of mind, all the sorts of things that sometimes it feels like the 1,000 things that can kind of make me miserable throughout the course of the day, like comparing myself to others or feeling like that didn't go well, or I screwed up there, or I said the wrong thing here, or whatever, or I could have done better with this. I can just sort of let that stuff go, and it doesn't actually have to hook me because I have this sort of beginner's childlike mind here. It's really possible.
Yeah, I'm reminded here recently, as like yesterday, was watching a teaching of the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, and the question for him was, is anger good? Is it ever any time, at any point is it good to be angry? And he said, absolutely. He said, it's good to be angry if you need to break through other people's false understandings of things. And so here we have Jesus as indignant.
Yeah.
And he said, it's very bad to be angry if it's based on perceived attacks upon your self-centeredness. These are my words. He said it, of course, beautifully, and I'm not saying it beautifully, but just what you're saying here, that Jesus' anger is to break through their ignorance. That's what he's trying to do. I just say personally in my own life, I find myself in a season where the undoing of all of that stuff, all that competitive male stuff, is the major work in my life now. And just like you, when I find it triggered, I just have to go, oh wow, yeah, that's amazing. It's still alive in there, and just to like say, pull the trigger back and say, oh no, we're all good here. We're all good here, and to see how much, certainly in boys' culture, that stuff is wired in, and perhaps not to genderify that. But,
everyone finds their challenge that in that department.
Yeah.
There's plenty of ego to go around.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thanks, everybody, for tuning in with us. And, our heart is always with you, and we're full of gratitude that you participate with us in the midrash of sorting out through the scriptures and wrestling with Jesus, both what he has to say with divorce and what this little child has to say to all of us as Jesus brings him before us. And we pray that the little child in your soul plays in the kingdom. And we love it when you subscribe and you share and you comment and you do all that stuff. And so peace be with you. We'll see you next week. God bless you. Take care.